Let's face it, the average American is inundated by a ceaseless barrage of info overload, multi-sourced distractions, insecurity, fear, and an ongoing parade of contradictory observations which literally paralyze the mortal mind.
Chaos is actually mostly caused by man-made ideology, basically. Like chaos of Stalin killing how many people because of the doctrine of communism, right? And Mao Zedong killing so many Chinese, where people are starving and eating dust.
Our population is striving to swim against the current of an electromagnetic tidal wave of social media. 3, 4, and 5G networks, smartphones, smart meters, and smart cities. Pollution, concentrated energy weapons, and a psychic cocktail of biodiversity mania that undermines the very soul of humanity. Chemtrails and GMO foods from spooky organizations. Vaccinations and psych drugs from Big Pharma. Mass-produced private propaganda from mainstream media, and undeclared wars from rogues in Congress. Yes, life in the U.S. Republic has become little different than ancient Rome.
Whether it's ancient Rome or the United States. When the state becomes very powerful, that power itself, it acts like a magnet. And the magnet attracts to it the predator class. And people who want to prey upon others, who want them to serve them, are attracted to the state because the state gives them the power to do that, and to do it in a legal form.
A plethora of power-grabbing control freaks now rule the U.S. empire. A parade of pedophiles and seats of power, from clergy to movie executives. False authorities in a runaway government hijacked by cultural Marxism and corporate fascism in the guise of political parties. Is it any wonder our youth, hatched from a liberal arts-infested academia, is screaming for socialism and universal basic income? The endless psychobabble of every failed political philosopher from Rousseau to Comte and Malthus?
The absolute worst of our species has come to essentially rule the rest of the human masses.
The animals are out of the barn and all over the farm. Everyone's uniqueness must be equal. Social justice and political correctness are the order of the day. Against this background, why wouldn't elites desire to usher in some new world order? An order to protect us, to save the environment, save the world. The only question that stands between such altruism and an impossible dream is the Hegelian dialect.
Now, one of the earliest philosophers of modern day socialist or communist totalitarianism was the philosopher Hegel. And he wrote an enormous encyclopedia of philosophy. And the concept of dialectic, which of course comes from classical times, was intended to be a method of reaching agreement between disputants.
Thesis, the initial idea. The antithesis, the contradiction of the initial idea. And then the synthesis, which in some sense is the composition of elements of both the thesis and the antithesis.
Thesis, antithesis, synthesis.
People in power create a problem so that they can present the solution to the problem.
Did these elites create the chaos in the first place? Many preeminent conspiracy researchers say they did.
The Hegelian dialectic is, in my opinion, at the heart and soul of our political morass. The government will create one position, and then it will create a problem that will counter that position, thus creating conflict between the positions. And then the government itself will come in and offer the solution.
Not only have global elites, what C. Wright Mills calls the power elite, caused the chaos, they put their plan to resolve the chaos in writing.
So if you look today at the power elite, whether Mills emphasized this or not, who would be at the top of the pyramid of power? Who would be the bankers and the financiers?
Ultra, mega, super rich people who have as an overriding agenda for their life to implement a one-world government by the end of the century.
And kids from Hollywood-nurtured academia, tomorrow's voters, are going to have no problem with a socialist world government, especially if it's for the greater good of the environment. So, if the globalists' plan to improve the world generates some Green New Deal, no Bernie Sanders voter or Elizabeth Warren groupie is going to complain.
And that is why we're in chaos, and that is why we have to reject this illegitimate notion of authority and really understand the difference between right and wrong under natural law, and then re-evaluate and align our behavior to natural law.
Given few are alert about the globalists' agenda, let's take a look at the plan and see if it will improve or dominate the world, as so-called conspiracy theorists are warning.
First of all, conspiracy theory is a view of reality that acknowledges that there are hidden forces at work in society, and that the people who are making things happen don't want the common folks to know about it. They have a hidden agenda, like hidden agendas in government and in the media, in the schools. So conspiracy theory is not anything except a propaganda phrase to encourage people not to listen to the information that's being presented.
Fortunately, the plan is all there in an easy-to-read 351-page document entitled Agenda 21.
Agenda 21 is a 351-page document, and obviously if anyone can go on the internet and see it, common sense would tell us that it could not be a conspiracy theory. It's a conspiracy fact.
In reading Clause 1.1 of the preamble, it's obvious Agenda 21 was written by lawyers. Given this, we now know that 99% of the global population, plus the illiterate, will probably not read it. Then, Clause 1.2 makes it clear that Agenda 21 is a global partnership, an innocent partnership built on a resolution from the UN's Friendly General Assembly.
All members of the United Nations belong to the General Assembly. Only a few belong to the Security Council compared to the 193 as General Assembly. The United States has a veto, but rarely exercises the veto. They go ahead and they accept whatever the UN wants to be done, and our ambassador to the United Nations, usually a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, will go along with almost anything.
Clause 1.3 goes on to say that the agenda reflects a global consensus and its implementation is first and foremost the responsibility of governments. By reading the first three clauses, any intelligent citizen can see that Agenda 21 is not only a plan and a partnership, but a call for governments of the world to unite. Sound familiar? Earlier, didn't Karl Marx, founder of communism, call for workers of the world to unite? The idea of uniting to overthrow capitalism and its middle class.
Karl Marx is known for his theory of Marxism and economics, where largely government controls the means of production and the power of the economy is not invested in the creativity of the individual, but invested more in government, and it's a top-down control of our economy as opposed to being driven by the people themselves.
So communism died. Or did it? Sounds like the United Nations has resurrected communism and repackaged it as Agenda 21. After all, what could be better than a planet-wide central system of government control to ensure better protected and managed ecosystems, as stated in Clause 1.1?
Central planning is a concept in totalitarian regimes by which all decision-making and all power and all wealth are held not by individual families, not by corporations, but only by the state. The state therefore takes all decisions, decides how every town and village should be planned, how it should look, how everything that moves and has its being in the country shall be directed from the center.
Let's take a closer look at just the United Nations itself, the organization that hatched Agenda 21, and see what some of its founding principles are. Let's start with the UN's Declaration of Human Rights, and see how it compares with the U.S. Bill of Rights.
In our Constitution, our Bill of Rights, our Declaration of Independence, we are very much told by the Founding Fathers that our rights come from God, that they are inalienable rights given to us by our Creator. The UN Declaration of Rights has no mention of God, no mention of a higher authority. The UN sees itself as the higher authority.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Not only based on human rights, but it's based on natural law.
Surely, if the UN is calling for its 193 governments to partner, they will be partnering behind worthwhile principles. Principles similar to the principles in the U.S. Constitution, a document that facilitated the creation of the freest and wealthiest nation that has ever existed. A nation that millions of people migrate to in order to escape their UN member nations.
The Bill of Rights is a set of absolutes. Here they are. You can't do this, this, and this, and there's no exception clause. Whereas the Declaration of Human Rights in the UN system specifically says, well, these rights can be exercised as long as they don't conflict with the purposes and goals of the United Nations. Well, who determines that? Well, the political people that are operating the United Nations.
We see that the following words are prominent in the U.S. Bill of Rights: petition, probable cause, trial by jury, due process, unreasonable searches, excessive bail, free state. But when we search for these words in the UN's declaration, none of them are present.
These are among the backbone of constitutional government and personal liberty. If you eliminate those, you basically have eliminated the essence of American liberty. Government is not seen in the American tradition as the grantor of rights, but rather as the protector of rights.
If you were to take the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, and the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, you will see two vastly different documents. One of them protects rights that are ours, God-given. The other one gives rights and then qualifies those rights out of existence.
I don't know about you, but this is a little creepy. A Bill of Rights for a 193 government partnership that has no mention of the right to petition, no mention of probable cause, no mention of trial by jury, no mention of due process, and no mention of freedom from unreasonable searches. The UN Declaration sounds like a recipe for a police state. But even scarier, it sounds like a recipe for a really big police state.
Jails, prisons, fines, death penalties if necessary. A police state is where its primary characteristic is that the police are at your doorstep. The police are telling you what to do, or at least they're to make sure you do it after the politicians tell you what to do. So a police state is a totalitarian state. What we need to do is get rid of the police component of the state. Let's make the state something to protect us, not to police us.
Out of the 195 countries in the world, the UN has 193 governments of these countries signed up to forward their non-binding agenda. That's a lot of governments, and none of them, or their people, are being advised to have a Bill of Rights that says anything about petition, probable cause, trial by jury, due process, unreasonable searches, excessive bail, or free states.
And you can read through most of each of these documents, but they also say then, but we can pass a law to suspend it. You can't suspend a Bill of Rights, anything in the Bill of Rights in the United States.
If this is the UN's view of human rights, it sounds like their agenda is not only a plan for a police state, but a global police state. The worst thing is, nowhere in the UN's declaration is the right to keep and bear arms, or the right to own real estate, what the founders called private property. These omissions guarantee what we're looking at could really be nasty, especially if the wrong people got in there to rule.
When you look at the basic liberties of man protected in the Constitution, firearms ownership and property rights are two of the most essential freedoms. They are, in many ways, two of the things that separate America from most of the rest of the world.
But global police state aside, if bearing arms and owning private property are missing, this also guarantees the UN's goal of combating poverty is impossible. Worse, if the UN knows this goal is impossible, because it knows people cannot get out of poverty unless they are free to own and register real estate, the agenda set forth in Agenda 21 is absolutely bogus.
Private property ownership is the greatest force in eliminating poverty. Where else do the average people have to build a substantial amount of wealth other than their property? Private property ownership, the equity in private property, is the means to create new businesses. 60% of American businesses were started by people using equity in their private property, and 60% of the American people were employed. And that's how we build an economy. That's how the United States, being one of the only countries in the world that really protected private property, became as wealthy and as free as it did in such a short period of time.
And just as bad as depriving people of the ability to feed themselves is depriving them of the ability to protect themselves. This is why the Founding Fathers clearly state in the American Bill of Rights that a well-regulated militia is necessary to the security of a free state. Therefore, the right of the people to keep and bear arms cannot be infringed.
The author, who we believe is Richard Henry Lee, said, it is essential to the preservation of liberty that the whole body of the people be trained. Okay, that's what well-regulated means. It means well-trained. And it doesn't mean government-regulated, in spite of what the government politicians and lawyers say. So essential to the preservation of liberty is having a well-trained body of people. Remember, he says the whole body of the people who are present and ready at a moment's notice.
But since the UN's Bill of Rights makes no mention of the right to keep and bear arms, one can only assume that the people in most of the UN's member nations do not have the right to keep and bear arms. Hence, none of them are on the way to being a free state, another term that's missing.
If the United Nations eliminates gun ownership and property rights or real estate ownership, the implications simply are this: we are then brought into bondage and we become hopeless and helpless because we will not be able to defend ourselves, our lives, our liberty, or our families.
If people are denied the right to private property and to arms, they will not be free. The idea behind this is that private property includes your person, and it extends to the idea that you can defend your body, your private property, as necessary. So the notion of these ideas is key to the establishment of America and to America's success to date.
So why is the United States one of the member states of the United Nations? This is a major outpoint and one that we, the people of the United States, should take a serious look at. If the UN's agenda is to partner, unite all the governments of Earth, and people do not have the right to keep and bear arms, who gets to keep and bear arms? Easy, all of the governments.
Is the arms-bearing stratum of society the mass of the people themselves, or is it some select group? And if it's some select group, who controls the ability of that select group to use those arms potentially against the rest of society? That's always been the conflict throughout history, right? Because what is government? I think Washington says this. Government is not eloquence. Government is force. That's the final analysis. And the armed stratum of society is the one that exercises that force. And the people who exercise force, the ultimate force in society, are considered what? The sovereigns. And under our system of government, the sovereigns are the people themselves. Therefore, they must have the ultimate control over force, and that's done through the militia structure.
So no guns and no real estate recommended in the UN's agenda for the 21st century. If this is the plan, it means there will be no free states and poverty will never go away. It means not only world domination, but universal poverty. Here is what the experts tell us about the cycle of poverty. A nation of people that is denied the right to own real estate, again, commonly referred to as private property, will never be able to generate wealth.
Private property is the most important element of our freedom. Private property in terms of real estate is extremely important because it gives us an opportunity to increase our wealth, to use it as an asset both in a productive way and also as collateral. So all free nations allow for and support the ownership of private property.
Most of the people in the world are in poverty because their UN member governments will not permit them to easily own and record or register real estate.
And what's been proven over and over again is those types of economy generate less wealth by essentially orders of magnitude than the entrepreneurial so-called capitalist economy, which is based, in part at least, on the ownership of land.
It takes 20 years before most real estate ownership can be recorded in Mexico. In Peru, it takes 289 days to legally register a business and a registration fee of $1,200, a year's income for most in that country. In the Philippines, it takes 168 steps involving 53 public and private agencies to register real estate. If an individual cannot record or register his ownership of real estate, that owner cannot borrow against his real estate. Banks will not loan money on real estate unless they can determine clear title of ownership.
Because it creates chaos. I mean, who are they lending the money to and for what purpose? And so there's just absolutely no security whatsoever in doing that. And we have all of our property registered. And then that's how you get equity in your property, and that's how you can prove ownership, and it's a legal situation.
Real estate titles, for instance, they are simply legal recognitions of who owns what. So that we're have the ability to say, at this particular time, this particular plot of land described in a certain way is owned by Mr. Jones, and then Jones can transfer title through the normal process of contract, property law, to others. And we have a record of who's who and what's what in terms of particular plots of land.
If banks won't lend on home equity, people cannot borrow money to start businesses. If people cannot start businesses, they cannot employ people who are starving or in poverty. Small businesses employ 90% of the population in a typical capitalist country. This is what happens in Western civilization, and why the United States has more wealth than the other UN member nations.
America's greatness has nothing to do with the power of our army. The uniqueness and the greatness of America is that we are the only nation in the world where every individual, every American, has the absolute right to own property. And it is that right of ownership that allows them to utilize and extract the wealth from the property they own.
Poor individuals and poor nations are thus never able to remedy their poverty because their governments suppress real solutions. Why do you think 20 million Mexicans have illegally flooded into the U.S.? They are in poverty. Why are they in poverty? No real estate.
So ultimately, land ownership is one of the basic aspects of freedom in any society. That's why you see in the typical communist socialist societies, say under Stalin and Mao Zedong, what was one of the first things they did? They collectivized as much as possible the land, put it under the control of the Communist Party.
Give a man a fish, but never show him how to fish. The socialists' answer to poverty is always the same. The rich, productive individual must give money to the poor, impoverished individual. And the UN's answer is similar. The rich, productive nation must give foreign aid to the poor, impoverished nation. It's called the redistribution of wealth under the doctrine of social equity.
Social equity is one of the three pillars of United Nations Agenda 21, Sustainable Development. And the idea is that the world is not fair. And so it's necessary to make the world fair by redistributing wealth, whether it's in terms of assets or technology, whatever it is that the developed nations need to give to the lesser developed nations in order to equalize their economies and their opportunities.
The socialists don't understand that well-being, security, standard of living comes from production. They don't understand that. They think that it comes from political edict. Socialists and other collectivists think that all they have to do is say, we're going to give every man, woman, and child a minimum wage or give them a certain level of health care or an education. They never think about where it comes from. They think all it takes is a bunch of politicians sitting around a table and voting for it. If we vote for it, well then bingo, it happens. They don't understand that if you do that and you take away the ability for those who create the wealth to maintain it, then they're going to stop creating wealth. And then nobody will have anything. So the only way you can have equality in a system is equality in poverty.
Take note, people of the developing world. You can generate wealth. You just need to assert your right to own real estate and guns to ensure these rights.
The citizens of every country in the world should demand the right to keep and bear arms because they are supposed to be the ones in charge first. You have to take responsibility for your own protection, your own self-defense, and for your own community's self-defense.
If people are denied the right to private property and to arms, they will not be free. And that's why America was such a unique formulation in the history of the world. It is the first country to recognize unalienable rights. Those unalienable rights are innumerable, but they certainly start with the idea that you have the right to the use and enjoyment of your property. And it extends to the idea that you can defend your property.
Since guns and property rights are omitted from the UN's agenda and its Declaration of Human Rights, a theory about its ultimate political aims can be postulated. With no property rights or guns, and all of the governments on Earth united, Agenda 21 is nothing less than a plan for the total and complete enslavement of humanity.
If universal but private property is denied to the people, they become immediately mere vassals of the state. One of the things I did when working for Margaret Thatcher was to devise a method which would allow ordinary people living in state-owned housing to buy that off the state at a preferential rate. Because if it denies them the right of private property and the right to own and use firearms, then it can rule over them absolutely without any fear of argument or contradiction.
The implications of the UN's Declaration of Human Rights not mentioning certain things like property rights is an indication that it is a rights-granting entity. So if we don't mention it, you can't do it.
And this is being done in the name of the environment, equality, and economy. What's known as the 3 E's found in Agenda 21 and its sister update, Agenda 2030. Environment. Pass endless executive orders and regulations to save the environment, even if it means the destruction of the U.S. manufacturing base.
Well, environment in my own sense and in the scientific sense, I would say the entirety of the sort of Earth system in the most natural way. I would even say that human is part of the environment, which means we are the natural product. In fact, most of the time, the funny part is when people are saying that, you know, human is sort of external to this climate system or the environment. We are as natural as naturalness come, in my humble opinion.
In the context of Agenda 21, what it means is that no species has any more rights than any other species, and that human beings are responsible for the planet in the sense that it is a single entity. So this concept of the one world allows for control of a single entity, and it actually enables that. It justifies the single world concept in terms of political, economic, and social controls.
Equality. Redistribute the wealth of nations and the wealth of individuals so everyone is equally poor, even if it means the destruction of the American middle class.
That's the idea for bringing the lesser developed nations up, and then to lower the wages in the more developed nations, because in fact you don't really need to have any more than whatever it takes to purchase whatever it is that the mega corporations are selling. So if you have savings, you have too much.
Economy. Print fiat money and practice fractional reserve banking to unjustly enrich the power elite, even if it means destroying the free market system. Yes, these are the three dimensions of what the UN calls sustainable development, a term coined in 1987 by the Brundtland Commission in a publication called Our Common Future.
The term sustainable development, according to the United Nations and the Gru Harlem Brundtland Commission, who wrote this book called Our Common Future, is the development that meets the needs of the present, but doesn't sacrifice the needs of future generations. It's not about the abundance that we have here on planet Earth. It's about creating scarcity, using fear-mongering tactics. One is, man-made anthropogenic global warming, or that farmers and ranchers are using 70% of the world's water for agriculture. These things are not true, but we're being told that, our cars' emissions as we drive our cars around are causing so much degradation to planet Earth that within 10 years, by the year 2030, we all must live sustainably and live a sustainable development lifestyle and get out of our cars and walk, bike, and take public transportation and be happy about it to save the trees, to save the biodiversity, to save the world from people like you and me.
And of course then they did decide that yes, everything that human beings are doing now does compromise the ability of future generations to meet their needs. And so the General Commission said to the World Commission on Environment and Development, well, can you come back in 5 years with the action plan to implement sustainable development worldwide? And that is exactly what they did.
Development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Bear in mind, the word development refers to the term real estate development. And recall what we said about the UN's ideal for real estate. Only governments and the power elite get to own it. To them, that's what is sustainable, their ownership.
What it really means is control of the environment, protecting the environment. And so no matter what your situation is, the environment comes in first. One of the interesting things about doing that is that the environment does not follow political boundaries. Rivers run through a whole lot of towns. So sustainable development is a scam that's set up to pretend like it's government. And what it does is eliminate political boundaries. And that means we're losing our liberty, and we're changing our system of government. We're losing our ability to elect our local officials.
So what else could top brass at UN headquarters in New York City, home of the globalists' propaganda networks and the bankers' fiat Federal Reserve, possibly be thinking? How can the needs of future generations be met if only the elite in the UN's 193 signatory governments can own real estate?
For whatever reason, perhaps it's part of their genetic code, but they are predators. They really want everybody else to work for them and to be their slaves, and they don't have any sensibility about or compassion for them. They just want to rule. And those are the ones that always gravitate for political power, because it gives them the option to acquire and feed these passions, acquire what they want and feed these passions, and not be thrown in prison, because they're the ones that run the prisons. So we go back to the question of the UN, which is the motivation, and I think it's both. Probably most of the people at the UN, certainly I'm going to guess around 97%, really want the best for their fellow citizens of the world. The other 3% probably figure I'm going to be the rulers. I'm going to be part of the ruling class. It's going to be cool for me, and a little piece of that, they're actually psychopaths, and they're going to make sure that their passions for cruelty are satisfied.
Seems like the real plan is to keep the present and future generations in poverty and dependent on an ever-expanding police state. Is that our common future? Bush 1, Clinton, Bush 2, and Obama all signed on to Agenda 21. These same presidents, delivered by both the Democratic and Republican parties, are working for world government envisioned by the globalists.
The beginnings of the world government already exist in the World Trade Organization, the UN, the IMF, the World Bank, the new International Environmental Authority, Kyoto. All of these things are the embryonic institutions of a world government, and at the end of the road, nations will lose their sovereignty and independence and basically become like Pennsylvania and Maryland are in the United States of America, which is states which have fundamentally lost enormous amounts of their national sovereignty.
The concept of sustainable development through better stewardship of the environment did not always exist. A series of events, conferences, and publications finally led the power elite to the rationale for adopting sustainable development as the UN's unifying principle. In 1918, at the conclusion of World War I, Randolph Bourne wrote, "War is the health of the state." Little did he know how unifying that statement would turn out to be.
The phrase "war is the health of the state" essentially means that as the rulers of a society can pit people against each other effectively, they are gaining strategic power over the rest of the population, because what war essentially does to any given population where it is being waged or conducted is it depletes that population of necessary resources, it depletes them of their prosperity, it puts them into a extreme consciousness of fear, and it sets them divided against each other. This is part of the ancient ruling class strategy of divide and conquer.
Ostensibly determined to end all wars, the power elite launched the League of Nations in 1920 from Geneva, Switzerland. Its mission? To achieve international peace and security by the acceptance of obligations not to resort to war. But then, in 1939, World War II happened anyway.
League of Nations was set up as the result of the war to end all wars, World War I, right? The principle of the League of Nations was we're not going to have any more wars because all the countries are going to get together and work out their differences in some kind of pseudo-parliamentary fashion. And then, of course, what happened? Well, the League of Nations were not able to control the situation, and you had the greatest war that had ever occurred, World War II.
The power elite disbanded the League of Nations and in 1945 launched the United Nations from San Francisco. A year later, John D. Rockefeller Jr. donated an $8.5 million parcel of land to build a permanent headquarters for the UN in New York City. Though the building was new, the United Nations had basically the same old mission: prevent the scourge of war. Unfortunately, or no surprise, from 1945 to 1966, the scourge of war intensified.
The United Nations, which is supposedly the perfection of the League of Nations, and we've had more wars going on, small scale of course, but you add them all up, there have been more bombs dropped and probably more people killed and more destruction than in all of World War II.
With the advent of the first atomic bomb used on Hiroshima, not only would wars continue, weapons themselves would continue to develop, thus giving rise to what President Dwight D. Eisenhower would call the military-industrial complex.
It's a combination of the military, the standing army of the United States, and the industrial corporations that tie into it through the production of goods and services that the military uses.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
And of course Eisenhower foresaw that this would expand, and the armed forces would want to expand their role, the corporations would want to expand their role, and the influence of the two would come together to control the direction of foreign policy primarily. And now we've gotten to the point where this complex consumes the vast majority of the federal budget.
54% of the budget, US budget, going to military. And we have over 750 bases around the globe. More than 500 bases are energy related. So just imagine how we can live in this country if we don't have all these problems. Yes, we have to protect ourselves, we have to be very strong, but in our land. We don't have to go around and do this what we're doing now. Just because of energy, what we don't need it. We don't need to import energy from anybody. We don't need to do all this work what we're doing now for anybody else.
American leadership is not just respected, it is required.
War is extremely profitable. You think of the industries that are involved in war. When you think of the thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of people that are getting a piece of the pie financially whenever a country goes to war. You think about the fortunes that have been made by the suffering and death of people involved in war. War enriches innumerable individuals and companies.
By 1967, it became clear that wars were not only profitable, they were going to continue, and the UN had no workable plan to stop them. This frustration may have been the reason a book entitled Report from Iron Mountain emerged as a New York Times bestseller and was translated into 15 languages.
And it was an analysis, supposedly, of how do you establish and promote and preserve peace and stability in the modern world. Well, then we find out what it means by peace and stability. Stability in their mind meant stability of government, and peace meant no opposition to government. And so the study really was about how do you design a system in the modern world in which governments don't have to worry about the people revolting against them.
Supposedly written by a secret government panel of 15 insiders, the book spoke openly about the role of war in sustaining governmental power.
And it talked about the different ways of keeping the people docile and mentally prepared to endure any kind of an insult to their personal liberty or their dignity. And that meant to get them involved in a war.
The report inferred that the reason the League of Nations nor the United Nations could prevent wars was because war actually provided vital functions to human civilization. War generates economic advantages. It ensures stability because it's the foundation of governmental authority. It controls military institutions necessary for allegiance and obedience. It motivates advancements in science and technology. And most importantly, it thins out populations. In other words, war is not only profitable, it's good.
Yes, it is profitable for people what they're selling the weapons. It is profitable. But what about regular American person? Why is there no sense?
When you think of the destruction, not just of property and of countries and economies, the massive death and destruction of individuals, the carnage of war, etc., is more horrible than most of us could realize.
War brings more government and moral decline. And anything that would generate a situation where war would be preferable is something that somebody else generated, and we, the people, are the victims.
Unfortunately, war is only good if a government can blow up just a few thousand people and only a small part of their city. Thus, to the power elite, even destruction of a city like Hiroshima, along with 80,000 people, is tolerable as a form of conventional warfare, or what might even be called population control. But all of this changed on November 1st, 1952, when the first hydrogen bomb was tested on the Marshall Islands in the North Pacific Ocean.
Yes, when everyone has the same absolute maximum killing capacity in a hydrogen bomb, that would be the mutually assured destruction. So therefore, it's a weapon that becomes more a psychological weapon than a military weapon. Those who have it have the advantage psychologically over those who do not have it.
Tesla ultimately had two overarching solutions to the problem of war. The first was his implementation of free electrical energy anywhere on the surface of the earth. Now, that would have taken people out of a mentality of scarcity over which almost all wars are fought. The second was he envisioned providing highly advanced technology, not just to one nation, but to all nations, similar to what we talk about in nuclear war as mutually assured destruction.
This bomb, and the arsenal of similar bombs that would surely follow, marked the end of what would become known as the war system. Whatever benefits the war system may have had, war with hydrogen bombs was not practical. Destruction would be so great, even the UN's member governments would be annihilated.